So he said he'd be here in about 10 minutes, so we're going to just proceed for now with the presentation. My name is Joe Adebato. I'm the Director of Counseling here at the high school, and we offer a variety of evening events throughout the course of the school year. Tonight, obviously, being financial aid, but we had this year, this is our last night event this year, but in September, we have a senior college planning night. We do a grade 9 and 10 academic planning night. We do another financial aid night, which is in October. And then we do a junior college planning night, which is in February. So we try to offer a variety of events, and I know there's only, let's see, 2, 4, 5, 6 people here tonight, but we record our events, and so that's why we're going to still use the mic. So BCAT is able to televise this and record it for those families that are unable to make it. We also do a counselor breakfast series. Has anyone been to any of our counselor breakfasts? Okay, great. So we have one tomorrow. It's specifically for junior parents. And if there are any junior parents here, you're more than welcome to attend. Even if you don't get your RSVP in, that's fine. We'll be right here at the high school in the counseling department. And that's just going to discuss all the aspects to the college process and to talk a little bit about going into next fall, what that's going to look like for seniors. So we've been very, very fortunate to work with Amy's staff here. I will let her talk about her background and credentials, but I can tell you she works with an agency called MEFA, the Massachusetts Educational Financial Authority. They are such a great organization. They've been sending presenters here to Burlington High School. I've been here since 2002, and every year we have presenters, and Amy has been doing this for a very long time. She's very experienced with the financial aid process. She's a wealth of information. So we're very lucky to have her presenting to Burlington parents. She's helped many parents here in our school over the years. And I would encourage parents to obviously take good notes tonight. It will be recorded. The one thing I do want to mention is just a little shout out to the Burlington Scholarship Program. Because when you think about financial aid, you obviously want to try to find free money as much as possible. And so the community of Burlington offers several scholarships each and every year to graduating seniors. In fact, last week on Thursday night, May 29th was our scholarship awards night, and we had about 180 seniors. We distributed just over $300,000. So it was such a great thing for those students. They can start college off with less tuition. And the way the local community scholarships work, they're just one-year scholarships, so they're paid out in freshman year. So the Burlington Community Scholarships aren't scholarships that are a yearly thing. It is in that first year, just as an aside. So again, keep your eyes on that. That really starts to pick up the pace senior year right around January or February. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amy, and hopefully she will be up and running shortly. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
All right, thank you all for being here. A little bit about myself. My name obviously is Amy Staffier, and currently I'm the Assistant Vice President of Enrollment, Student Services, and Director of Financial Aid at Simmons University in Boston. I've been there for 7 years as of May, which just the time flies. And then prior to that, I worked, and lately I've been saying, well, good, I don't work there anymore. I worked for 21 years at Harvard in undergraduate admissions and financial aid. Not that I wouldn't want to work there, but they're obviously having some difficulties with the current administration. And then additionally, I have been doing presentations like these. Goodness, sometimes it's getting to like, how long has it been? 25, 26 years. I do this as a volunteer on behalf of MEFA. So you heard that reference, the Massachusetts Educational Financing Authority. It's a not-for-profit state authority here in Massachusetts. One of the things that I really appreciate about them is that they provide this sort of information for families, but also for our guidance staff at high schools. They do programming for them, and I think that's really important. They also have our state help with our state's college savings plan, 529 plan, and they also have some funding available for Massachusetts residents as far as loan funding, as well as students who might be coming into the state and attend a state institution. they have funding for them as well. One of the things that has always been really important to me and why I continue to do this is that I understand, even if you're going through this for a second time or a third time, it can be confusing. Things change. We've had a lot of change in the past couple of years. This is what I do day in and day out, and so I feel, really a moral obligation to be able to give back and present information. I also have I can't believe a senior next year in college, and then I have who will be a sophomore in college. So I also have the parent experience as well. So we are going to kind of go through the types and sources of financial aid. We will talk about the application process, how those decisions are made. Thankfully, the first few slides I can really go through without you needing to see them, but as we get into kind of how decisions are made and paying the bill and stuff like that, hopefully we'll get those slides up and running. But I also did send the presentation, and so and it is recorded, and so I'm sure that can be sent out to people. And if at any time while I'm talking, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I am happy to answer any questions as we go along. And then I always say that, if you have a question that, maybe you don't want to ask in front of the whole group, I'm also happy to hang around at the end, put the microphone away, and answer any questions, personally at the end. So, types and sources of financial aid. So first of all, what exactly is financial aid? What does that make up? And so it really kind of goes into a couple of different buckets. We have grant and scholarship aid, so that's the free money that does not need to be repaid. We have student loans, so that's money that the student borrows, right? And then they're repaying that in the future. And then there's another bucket of money that's called federal work study, and that's an allotment of funding that the federal government gives to an institution, and the institution has to use those dollars to employ students on campus. And it funds up to 75% of the student wages, so the institution ends up paying 25%. But we are also required to use at least 7% of our allocation for community service work, so employing students where 100% of those work study dollars are employing that student to do community service work, which is really great. That's always something over my 28 plus years doing this that has always been confusing. Like, what exactly is this work study? How does it work with, with the bill and things like that? The student's getting a job, they're getting a paycheck, just like if they got any sort of job and they don't see any difference, everything is kind of done on the back end. This slide has some detail to it, and it's actually a slide I hate presenting at this point in the presentation because I haven't really talked about some of the concepts that I would like to talk about. But the slide, you can't see it unless you all came right here and hovered around my laptop, but it says federal direct loans. So it's just a slide that just kind of an overview on those federal student loans. A couple of the things that I really point out on this particular slide is, oftentimes we hear in the news about the crushing loan debt and how that, is kind of burdensome to students. It's not through borrowing these particular loans at the undergraduate level because there are limits on what a student actually can borrow. A first-year student can borrow up to $5,500. A second-year student can borrow up to $6,500. And then junior, senior year, they can borrow up to $7,500. So if they borrow those maximums in the 4 years, it's $27,000 that they're borrowing. So there really are limits there. I feel like it's really important that there's information provided about the loans because oftentimes, and I've had students come in with kind of misconceptions on loan funding or what they could utilize that might actually be able to help them. One of the things that I haven't spoken about yet is kind of eligibility. And so there are Within this loan program, a student could borrow, if they're eligible, up to $3,500 in that first year out of the $5,500 as a subsidized loan. And what that means is that the interest is not accruing, it's subsidized. The government is paying that interest while the student is enrolled. And that would typically be through the 4 years, and then they wouldn't go into repayment, and interest wouldn't begin to accrue until 6 months after they graduate. And I only say typically because if a student withdrew altogether from school, right, let's say after the first year, after the second year, in 6 months they would go into repayment and it would start to accrue interest. But should the student stay enrolled those 4 years, that loan actually does not accrue anymore. So they graduate, 6 months later it's still $3,500. That's really important for students and for parents to understand that. Gosh, it's probably been more than 15 years that the limit was actually $3,500 first year, and $4,500 and then $5,500. And at the request of, rising cost of education, could there be an increase? And the government said, okay, but the increase is $2,000 each year, and it can only be unsubsidized, even if the student is eligible for a subsidized loan. So if you're eligible for that subsidized version, you're going to see the student will see two loan items on their financial aid package: subsidized federal loan, unsubsidized. And if there's no eligibility for the subsidized version, you would see one loan. It would say federal unsubsidized loan, $5,500. So unsubsidized means that the interest does begin to accrue from the point that the loan is dispersed. It's dispersed in equal installments, fall and spring. So it would only start to accrue interest on whatever dispersed, in fall at that point. And interest can either be paid quarterly, or probably more typical is that it's capitalized and it's added onto the loan and paid in repayment. I think those are most of my talk about the federal student loans. I'll probably circle back to that when we start to look at and hopefully have that presentation showing up here. This is a slide that shows just the different sources of financial aid, right? And so we have the funding that comes from the federal government, right? And that would be the loan funding that I talked about. And then they have one grant program, the federal Pell Grant. That may have been something that you've heard that term used before. Is it going to come on? That just threw me off. I apologize. The federal Pell Grant, I think it's also important to note that the federal Pell Grant at the highest cost institution, like a private institution, for a family that is expected to basically not really pay through the federal application form, the maximum federal Pell Grant is $7,395. That doesn't mean that there's limits, with funding other places, but it's important to know that really institutions really put a lot into the financial aid pot, and that the government, yes, there's some funding, but that Pell Grant, which first came out back in the mid-'60s and covered kind of a large portion of the tuition cost, has not kind of kept up with that rising cost. I think, and then work study is that other component that comes through from the federal government. One thing I would note is that that's something that's called campus-based funding. So as I noted, it was an allocation from the government to an institution. Not all institutions have the same allocation. Some may have a very small amount, or none at all. And so it may be that the student is offered that work study at one institution and not at another. And that may just be that the school doesn't have enough funding to stretch across, or they have a certain way in which they're figuring out how to stretch that funding. It doesn't always mean that a student can't work on campus. That's really dependent on the institution, and that can be something that you ask, as you go through any visits, campus visits, what sort of opportunities exist. even outside of work study or with work study to work on campus. So those, I actually have a T-shirt that says "It depends," and oftentimes when I don't usually wear it when I'm doing this presentation, but I kind of joke that I should, but I will answer questions, and my answer very honestly is "it depends," because every institution is different, particularly when in awarding their own funds or what they're able to provide as far as employment opportunities, on campus. All right, we're getting closer. So the next block is from the state of Massachusetts. From the state of Massachusetts. So if the student is a Massachusetts resident, and they attend a Massachusetts school, not a public institution, but any institution in Massachusetts, they will be assessed to see if they're eligible for any sort of Massachusetts state funding. Filling out the FAFSA form, which is the federal application for financial aid. Yay. No, I'm right here. Just click that. Yeah, right there, so that they can see the large. Yes, okay, perfect, yay. So here we are over here in Massachusetts, completing the FAFSA form, which is that federal form, and the student answering the question that they're a resident of the state of Massachusetts. That information will automatically go to the state. The state has something called the Mass State Grant that is similar to the federal Pell Grant. It goes to the lower income families within the state, although starting with this current year, FAFSA, there had been a lot of changes. We did see kind of an increase in eligibility for students who are eligible for that, so like at a little bit higher income level than previously. There are most of the scholarship and tuition waivers are for our public institutions. There has been a lot of increase in funding from the state to our public institutions. I almost hate to note that there's a loan program with the state only because it's really small. It's called the Massachusetts No Interest Loan, so that obviously sounds wonderful. It is a loan where the state allocates to an institution, and the institution is able to provide that funding to students who are residents of the state of Massachusetts. When I was at Harvard, we had an allocation of about $30,000. At Simmons, we don't have an allocation, and every year I have tried to mark off the box to get an allocation, and the funding just isn't there. So I just don't want to make it seem like, oh, this is something that you're going to see at each institution. It's just not. And then I noted here that colleges and institutions, universities, also provide grant and scholarship aid, and oftentimes you see a more significant amount, especially at a private institution that might be coming from the college or university themselves. I would say with these terms, grant and scholarship, typically when you see this word grant, it's related to need-based awarding, which is kind of income and asset information of a family. And typically, and I think our next slide is about that, and this word scholarship typically is related to, it's been awarded to a student based on merit. And we'll talk about those two kind of awarding philosophies. Very similar to the state of Massachusetts. Don't really expect that institutions have loan funding. They may, like we have a very small pot that I use currently at my institution that I use really for emergency purposes because it's just really small. But don't expect that you're going to see that at every institution. And then Joe kind of mentioned, here in Burlington, the scholarships, but outside scholarships or private scholarships is another funding source, and oftentimes students coming right out of high school will see that they have some scholarships that they might have won, through the high school, through local organization, Elks Club, Lions Club, things like that. What I'm going to do is just kind of pause on that because I think what often becomes the question outside of kind of the real local that is a little bit easier, like within the high school application process, there are these these larger organizations. MIFA Pathway is one, FastWeb, through the College Board. You may have heard of Big Future and these like large scholarships. And students basically complete a profile about themselves and then are emailed the information about the scholarships that they are eligible to apply for. What I've heard, the feedback is that it could be overwhelming because, you know, if the criteria is very basic, right? Let's say you need to live in Massachusetts or, you know, be female or whatever the criteria is, they get a lot of emails as far as, oh, you look to be eligible for all of these. And so it becomes work to go through and decide, okay, which ones am I going to apply for? None of them typically are just complete an application. It's oftentimes, you know, some sort of essay as well. And so the question, you know, becomes, oh, is it really worth the work? And so what I'll do is just kind of answer that when we're looking at a sample financial aid package, and you can relay that message, you know, to your children when you're kind of having that discussion with them. Right. So these two slides, next two slides, just really talk about how aid can be awarded to students. So it could be determined based on merit, right? So there's some reason that the student is being offered the scholarship. And so there are oftentimes, particularly in private institutions, through the admission process, there might be some merit scholarship funding available to students. They're going to be looking at criteria, and these funds may or may not be renewable. If they are renewable, oftentimes there's something that the student needs to do. So think of, you know, maybe it was an academic scholarship and they have to maintain a certain GPA in order to retain it in the following year. Certainly if a student goes to a school that is able to provide, say, a sports scholarship, right, they may have to remain on the team. Or maybe the student is, you know, a fantastic oboe player and that particular marching band needs an oboe player, and there might be, you know, a requirement there. It should be clearly stated on any communication the student gets about that funding. Oftentimes I joke with my admission colleagues, like, could you make the font any smaller? They like to keep it on one letter, and they always tell me, can you put it on your letter on just onto one page? I was like, absolutely not. I like to stretch it out because I think things get lost, you know, when they're crunched into a small page. But make sure you're looking at that, the student is looking at that to understand what it is that may be required of them. No, they're not offered at all institutions. This will be the first time that I say, you know, make sure your child, yourself, looking through. I know it can be overwhelming, the amount of materials they might come in. I know that students can get bombarded with emails, right, that are coming in, and it can kind of be too much. But maybe just take some time and sit down, right? And, you know, when you're more narrowed down on some of the places you might want to, the child is thinking maybe of going, and sit down together and look at some of that information, or just go right to their website, because it should all be listed there. Go to the admission page, look at the financial aid page. One of the things that I always talk about on this slide is the fact that some of these scholarships, some institutions may have a scholarship that has an early deadline, right? So something that might be a little more selective. For instance, at my institution, we have 2 scholarships. So our general merit scholarships, you just have to apply for admission, and we're gonna assess you for any student for those scholarships. But we also have one that's a full tuition scholarship, room and board, and there's a stipend, as well as one that's a full tuition scholarship for Boston students who go to a Boston high school. Those require an application as well as, you know, some other material, and have a much earlier deadline, right, like November, December timeframe. And so what I do remember is implanted in my head was a conversation when I was first at Simmons back in 2018. I started in May, and this was in that first fall semester. And a student who was a current student, who was maybe a sophomore, came to my office and met with me and said, is there any way that I can apply for this Kotson scholarship? And she said, I didn't know about it when I was applying to the university. And this was a student who was kind of came from a low-income family, really could have used that full tuition scholarship, but unfortunately it's only for students coming into the university. There was no pathway, but it still hurts my heart to hear that, like, I didn't know about it. So that's just an example. Again, not every institution is gonna have that, but looking at the materials, the website, you're gonna get a sense of, and your child can get a sense of what is available at an institution. And you'd think that my own child would pick up on, some of the things that I talk about. My older one is one of those kids that she just does all the things. And the younger one, as my older one, I say, she's 21 going on like 76, and my younger one is 19, 100% going on 19, and she's like, I think I want to transfer. And then she just applies to this place and brings me this, and I'm like, what? Okay. You realize you're like 2 months past the deadline that you needed to apply to be, could you, to get some scholarship. But anyway, it's really important to pass this information on. They may or may not listen to us, but we can try our best. Need-based, so this is the other way that that funding is provided, and probably a more significant amount is assessed in this way. So it's looking at income, asset, and kind of family size, typically through one of two forms. So there's a federal form that we're going to talk about that every institution, if you're applying for aid, you have to fill it out, and then there is a second form as well that some institutions, when awarding their own funding, will request. This second bullet point, that the eligibility is determined by a standardized formula, I don't love that bullet point, only because, yes, for any sort of federal funding, it is that standardized formula. But if an institution is awarding their own funds, they may be using this other form, and it doesn't mean that it's less generous. Quite honestly, we used to use that at Harvard, and we were more generous than what on the federal government side. But I do just like to, point that out. And this would include grants, loans, and then work study as well. And then this last bullet point, that students must be making satisfactory academic progress. We used to not even really talk about this that in this presentation, but I do feel like it's important, to hear and know what that means. The federal government is kind enough to put particular regulations on myself and my staff. A lot of them, very much relate to what we're doing, and then some of them seem to stretch out into the university. And this is one of them where the government says that we have to determine if a student is making satisfactory academic progress in order to continue to receive their financial aid. And every institution has some sort of academic policy. But this one is, they kind of put a baseline that a student has to at least be at a 2.0 by the end of sophomore year. Oftentimes an institution will just use that 2.0, throughout the entire time. So there is a determination each year of that based on GPA, but then we also have to look at PACE. And this one is one where we saw some issues through COVID, where when we had students, I hate even bringing COVID up, but where we had students who maybe started, and we were fully online, it was like, this is not for me, and had to withdraw past kind of that withdrawal deadline. And PACE is that the amount of credits that you attempt, so that you've started, and then compared to the amount of credits that you actually complete, you have to be at a 67% figure there. Now, a student who just begins and withdraws out of all of their classes is already immediately at 0%, and they're not eligible for funding. And I don't say that to scare anyone. I say that to alert you to the fact that there's always an appeal process, and the government has that built in, and each institution has that. So even so much as a merit scholarship that a student might lose, perhaps they didn't meet the GPA, and maybe they were close, or maybe there was reasoning. What I always say, and sometimes I go back, to my office and I'll say, you guys probably would hate me if you knew what I say out there to people, because you know what? I always say, ask. Because the worst they can say is, no, we're not able to do something. But if a student loses a scholarship or there's a SAP issue, is there an appeal process? There were special circumstances, et cetera, and oftentimes there is. For SAP, 100%. For a merit scholarship loss, not every institution is going to do that, but again, ask the question. Because again, the worst they can say is no, but man, if they said yes, that's fantastic. All right, so looking at the application forms and the process, so the financial aid timeline, really important to know the deadlines and know the forms that each institution is requiring. I'm a checklist person. I'm also really a sucker for paper and pencil rather than Excel, even though maybe it's because I'm on the computer all day working in spreadsheets, but I love writing something down. No matter how you do that, or using MIFA as a college application manager, listing each institution, what form is required, what the admission deadline is, what the financial aid deadline is. Now, over the years, I have worked at 2 institutions that if a student misses the deadline, we're still going to take that information and we're still going to assess them just as if they had met the deadline. Over the years at meetings that I've been at with colleagues, at various institutions, I have heard that deadline really matters. And maybe it means less in funding if they miss the deadline. Or maybe it means, there isn't funding available because they have a small pot of funding. So I always will emphasize the fact that meeting that deadline is really important. So to kind of zone in on that. You're likely going to apply for financial aid before you actually receive any admission decision, except in the case of, say, early action. It might be that you're doing that around the same time, or that you've applied for admission first and then kind of completing that financial aid application. Honestly, that's also an it depends scenario, based on the school. And the student may hear about admission before they're hearing about financial aid. And of course, over the last 2 years where we've had some large changes with the FAFSA and delays that had happened, now Congress last year had put into place it has to open on October 1st, so we'll go back to our quote unquote normal timeline. I feel like we haven't had a normal in a while. I know for myself, one of the things that I've prioritized is trying to, if a family has gotten their information in, by the deadline, we try to align and send their financial aid information along with the admission information, because I just feel like for myself, that's really helpful to have all of the information rather than just maybe a merit scholarship or just, yay, you're in and here's this full cost, but we don't know what the rest is. But every institution is a little bit different. But I will talk about the different tools that are available that can give you a sense of what the student might end up receiving as financial aid, so that can be really helpful. So the FAFSA form, the free application for federal student aid. This is the form that is kind of managed by the Department of Education, and it is free to complete. And any student who is applying for funding, who is a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, is going to be required to complete this form. I will say that the changes that went into place were put into place for 2 reasons. One, to make it easier to apply. And they actually managed to do that after getting through a cycle where it was severely delayed and there were issues last year. So the class that just finished their freshman year this year, one of the things that we saw with this next round, so the students who will start next year, was because I'm part of group of financial aid administrators in the state, and we help with something called FAFSA Day. And we've done this for years and years, where we would even come to high schools, right, and in the computer lab and help people complete that form, because there'd always be questions. Since COVID, we have done all online, and this year, the amount of people that came to those sessions was so low, and for the majority of people who came in, they just wanted to know, I think I did it wrong. It was so quick. Like, they didn't ask any information. So it really is streamlined and very easy, because most of the information is all just being pulled into the application. It does need to be completed every year, and it's available at FAFSA.gov or studentaid.gov. Either of those sites will get you there, and it will open on October 1st of this coming year for anyone whose child, will be a senior next year. And then that will be, there's always 2 years that are open at a time. And so in October, you'll see that the 25-26 application is still there, and then this 26-27. So it's the award year, or the academic year that the student would be a first year in college is what you're looking for. So that 26-27 application. Some of the language that's used, has anyone completed a FAFSA before? Great, so it doesn't even matter. This is all just like, this is how it will be. That was always interesting. It's like, have you completed one before? Yes. Well, okay, let's talk about how it's very different. But you wouldn't know that things weren't called a contributor in the previous. But how it works is that the student kind of fills out their own application, and then the parent contributor fills out their own that gets connected to that student application, and then that gets to an institution, where it used to be that it's kind of like one FAFSA that the student starts, and then part of that was the parent information and application. But these are really kind of 2 separate logins where you're not seeing that student information. And the student information is really like demographic information, and then it gets connected with the IRS information. The student really should start the application, and then they invite their contributors to contribute to their application. And then the last contributor can actually submit the FAFSA. So each contributor has to sign, so the student has to sign, and then that parent contributor has to sign. If the student completed the application, didn't sign it, and then the parent started and they signed it, it would still be sitting there waiting, because that other, the student contributor did not sign the application. I will say, and I guess my little dot is not working, but the last bullet point there, understanding the FAFSA webinar. MIFA has done that every fall. Actually, I think I may have done that presentation for a number of years. And we kind of just walk through the form line by line. And they have saved. The other thing is that that's a great resource is if you go on the MIFA website, there's a lot of saved presentations that they have. So they'll record one that they keep on there, one for the FAFSA, one for the CSS profile that I'll talk about. And then one of the great things they do is kind of the, they used to call it kind of after the bill or after the acceptance webinar. So you sit through a presentation like this, whether it's in the spring or in the fall, and you have all this information, but then it's months, right, before you actually start getting all of the acceptances and the financial aid, and then you sit there like, oh wait, what did Amy say? They do those virtual webinars where they kind of walk through things. You can ask questions and such. One of the things that you actually can do now is for both the parent contributor and the student contributor, they each need an FSA, Federal Student Aid ID. And that is something that can be done ahead of time. I also just suggest that it doesn't have to be right now, but you want to do that ahead of actually sitting down to complete the FAFSA in October. So if you don't want to do it now and kind of save that ID number somewhere, at least in September, I would say, get that completed, because it takes a couple of days to authenticate and then be able to use and log into the FAFSA and then sign that FAFSA form. So if you're someone who's like, oh, I'm going to sit down and fill out the FAFSA, but you don't have the FSA ID, you're not going to be able to sit and complete that. So you want to get that information first. As you see here, wait about 2 to 4 days before you can start the FAFSA. You have to have an email address, a distinct one. One of the things that I always note is for students, right, for their own email address, really like ensure that they're not using their high school email address. Sometimes we see that, but then they don't have access to it. And reminders go for the next year to complete that form. So that's important. And then this second to last bullet point on who needs the FSA ID. So the student obviously needs their own FSA ID as the student contributor. And then for the other contributor, which would be parent, it depends on the situation. So if parent is married, filing jointly, then technically only one parent needs an FSA ID to log in, give consent, and sign. If the parents are married filing separately, but they're still, married, then each of those parents needs their own FSA ID, and that is because it is used to actually connect with the IRS and pull that tax data in. So it can't be used off one because they're filing separately. So they kind of started to suggest like every parent should get an FSA ID, and that's fine, but technically, if you're filing jointly, both parents in a two-parent household do not need that FSA ID. I think the next slide we kind of talk about whose information needs to be on the form. And then if a student is a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, but the parent is not and they don't have a Social Security number, they're still able to now get an FSA ID where they used to not be able to. They could kind of just put all zeros and push through the system and print a paper signature form, and that can no longer happen, but they're able to get an FSA ID answering some knowledge-based questions that's actually pulled off of credit report. So what is reported on the FAFSA? Very general kind of demographic information on the student, obviously the student citizenship status. The student is going to note the colleges where they are applying. It's pretty easy. They can search by name. They can search by state and input those colleges. Something that I do like to point out is that the student doesn't have to have a finalized list to complete the FAFSA. So let's say a student knew that they wanted to apply to this one school early, or they just knew that they wanted to apply to this one school, but they were uncertain yet on the remaining schools. You can absolutely complete the FAFSA with just that one school. Then they can go back in and add schools, and that information will get sent to that school. So don't feel like it has to be a finalized list before completing the form. Always be mindful of deadlines, right, and just meeting those, and just make sure that they go back in. Because I've had actually, I remember sitting with a family actually at an accepted student stage. So the student was already accepted, and the parent came in and like, so we were just waiting on that financial aid, and I look up the student, I was like, we don't have the FAFSA. And I can actually go into the system, and if the student hasn't listed our institution, we get like an alert. It's like, your institution's not listed, so you can't pull that. And I was like, we're not on the forms. What? I thought she told me. So just remember to make sure that all those institutions are added. So parents, parents who are married, including same-sex parents, both parents' information are included on the FAFSA form. All parents who live together, married or not, both of their information is to be on the FAFSA form. And I've seen some different situations where there's, oh, we're divorced, but we're still living together. If they're living together, both parents' information is on the form. Divorced or separated and living separately, and some institutions may ask for that verification, right? Of, maybe bills, separate address, what have you, may look for that. The government says it's the parent who provided more financial support in the last 12 months and that parent's current spouse. So it has always been that if a parent is remarried, that current spouse's information is on the FAFSA. But there was a little bit of change with this new FAFSA where it's the parent who provided more financial support in the last 12 months. And then if parents provide equal support, use the parent with greater income or assets. This is not something that our office is monitoring, nor is the federal government monitoring that. I've had that question before, like, how are they going to know? You need to determine that, amongst yourselves. And then a legal guardian is not a parent, right? So, I've had a situation where, a student's parents passed away and they were living with, a grandmother, and that person's information should not be on the FAFSA form. It ends up being just the student information. The number in the household will be pulled directly from the tax return. And I'm always working in like multiple tax years. So 26, 27, I think is going to be 2024 income information, because it's usually 2 years prior. So it's going to be pulled off of the tax return, but you will have, it used to be in the old world, you were reporting household size and number in college. They're pulling that household size based on the tax return, but you have the opportunity to update that. So I can think of an example of sometimes in a divorced parent situation, written into kind of the agreement is one parent claims the child, it bounces year to year, but the student might actually be living in your household so that you can update that information. And then it will ask for a number of children in college, although that isn't used in the calculation for determining eligibility. The financial information, I was good. 24 income information for parent and student. And again, it pulls directly from the IRS. You have to give consent in order for it to pull. And each contributor has to provide consent, or the student is ineligible for any funding if that consent is not given. You won't see that information come in, and it's not every bit of information. It's certain data elements. It's AGI, it's taxes paid, it's total income, and some untaxed income and education credits. So it's a limited amount of information that actually does pull in. And there's all kinds of new security regulations around that data. In fact, institutions had to set up additional mailboxes to actually receive that information, have additional sign-off because the IRS has pretty strong security measures in place. One thing I always point out is, and usually I'm giving this presentation in the fall, but, it's going to be asking about 24 income. And, we are right now already deep into 25. And then when you're starting, it's 26. Things happen, right? Hopefully not for any of you, but, job loss or medical expenses or what have you, right? Things do change. We're required to use that kind of base year tax data, but we're also given something called professional judgment, the ability to use professional judgment. Documented, we have to document everything, any decisions, and we can change certain data elements. So for example, if 25, right, there was a loss of income, we could collect that 25 tax return year-end statement, and we could possibly use that to adjust the financial aid. So each institution is different in how they may collect that and what they may want you to do, but I can guarantee, because we are required to document, that each one is going to be looking for some sort of documentation as well as an explanation of what those circumstances are. So parent and student asset information, one thing that I always like to point out is it is an income-driven formula. So it's based more on income than assets, but it does ask for asset information. It's about 5% of parent assets that kind of get pulled into the kind of final output determining eligibility. It's about 20% on the student side. But it's not including all assets, so savings, checking, investment, any business, farm, and other property. So if you, say, own a summer home, a second, a two-family that's not your primary residence, those would be other property. But it doesn't include your primary home value. It doesn't include the value of retirement, nor does it include any life insurance. So those aren't asked about at all, and you shouldn't provide that information anywhere. As far as any kind of 529 or education saving account, it's considered a parent asset, which is more beneficial because the parent is assessed at a lower rate, but usually it's the parent is the owner and the student is the beneficiary, of course, unless, say, a grandparent or another relative was the owner of the asset and the student's the beneficiary, then you're not reporting that information. But it used to be that you had to report for all children if you had a 529 now, and I think they may fix this because I think it came out that that wasn't what they intended, but that's how it's written now. You're just reporting for that child that you're completing that FAFSA form for. And then child support received is actually considered an asset and kind of asked about in the asset section. And that is actually because the changes that happen in the FAFSA were through law, and by law, they can no longer ask any income questions that don't come off the tax return. And so that's why child support is being treated as an asset, which actually, again, is more beneficial. The other thing that is no longer asked about, it used to, in the old form, untaxed income, probably the largest amount of untaxed income we would see was money that a family put into like a 401k or a 403b that would show up on a W-2, and they no longer ask for that and have that counted back in as income. And then there's no place on the FAFSA that you're reporting any debt, except in the case of, let's say, a second property, right? You're obviously taking the value less any debt, and it's that net value. So the other application or two other applications potentially that you may need to complete is, one of them is called the CSS profile form. CSS is the College Scholarship Service, right? So the same entity that does the SATs and AP testing as well. Not to scare you, but this is no joke. So there's so much about the FAFSA and making that simpler, and the profile is a lot of information. It doesn't have any connection with the IRS, but even prior to that, it asks a lot of information. So there's about 240-ish institutions and scholarship agencies that use the profile form. You're going to, when I was at Harvard, we collected that information. In institutions that may have more in funding that they're trying to award, more selective institutions, it's going to ask similar information, right? So demographic information, it's going to ask, and you're going to have to report it yourself because it's not pulling from the IRS. 2024 income, 2025, and then an estimate on 26, which won't be full-blown every single field. 24 you will, but you're just kind of giving some sort of an estimate, moving out of the 24. And then it does ask for more asset information. It does ask about home value. It does ask about retirement. It doesn't mean that every institution is using that. So an example I can give is when I was at Harvard, we asked about, that was asked on the form. We didn't use that in our calculation of what a family was eligible for. And I don't know any institution that, even if they are using home value, that it's the full amount that's going in. It might be a percentage that kind of comes into the formula. Some schools may only ask for this in the first year, and then you're kind of off the hook. They want some sort of baseline. Some institutions, it may be that you're completing it each year. It should be, on the school's website if they require it, but you can also go to the profile, the CSS profile website to see what schools, and if any of those are schools that your child might be applying to. There is potentially a cost, so that is something that's a little different than the FAFSA. So $25 for the first school, $16 for each additional, but there are fee waivers. So if the student was eligible for a fee waiver, say for the SAT, if they took that, they're typically going to be eligible for the fee waiver for the profile as well. It also becomes available October 1st. Also, another difference from the FAFSA is that while the profile itself is kind of historically what we would have called the custodial parent in a divorced, separated parent situation, there is also this kind of non-custodial profile that would need to be completed by that non-custodial parent. In situations that are kind of extreme and there's no contact or something like that, you do have to work with each institution to see about any sort of waiver on that. And also know that the information does not cross or is not shared. It is only sent directly to the institution. So no party, in that situation is going to see each other's information because they're actual separate forms. I would suggest if you have to complete the profile, there is that What to Know About the CSS Profile webinar. Each institution can also add questions. I've sat with people before as they're completing it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this school asks this set of questions, and you get a drop down of more questions that you have to answer. So that can just be helpful to kind of sit and walk through that. They'll do them live, but there are also recorded ones. And I wouldn't stress over it now. That's something in the fall. Pre-new FAFSA, I would have said probably no one really is doing their own institutional financial aid application, although I used to talk about, I had sat with a student who had come to my presentation, and I was sitting with them, and they had told me what schools they were applying to, and so just because that's how I am, I had already pre-sat down and looked at websites, and I said to her for this one institution, oh, did you do there's an institutional form? I had no idea. And so I would always say, just make sure you know what is required at each institution, and again, what those deadlines are. But most institutions really don't have their own form. Maybe if they have some particular funds, right, that have restrictions on it and they need to get some information that they're not able to get off of the other forms. Although we did see with the new FAFSA that a few schools kind of created their own form so that they could get information out early. I don't necessarily see that that's going to be a continuing theme, and it was more of an option, right? So for their early pool, if they wanted to get estimates. But no matter what, even if they have their own institutional, you have to complete that FAFSA form if you're looking to for them to verify information as well as to be considered for any federal or state funding. So after you apply, colleges and the state of Massachusetts, as long as the student has entered Massachusetts as their state of residence, is going to get that FAFSA data. The student will also receive something called a FAFSA submission summary, just a detail of everything that they have entered. Notice that I said everything that they have entered. It's not going to show any sort of income information that is coming off that tax return because that's all protected. It doesn't come through the form. The FAFSA submission summary is also going to tell the student what their SAI, which is a student aid index, is. That's kind of the output of the FAFSA form. And it's going to tell them if there's anything that they need to follow up on. Now, when a student submits, it takes 24 to 48 hours for them to get that FAFSA submission summary for institutions to receive that information. That's because there's a number of checks that happen, right? Checking for citizenships, checking that a student isn't in default on loans, and a couple of other things. And so if any of those things show up as a flag, it's going to get noted on that submission summary, and it gets sent to the institution as well. So we may, as an institution, collect additional documentation. Quite honestly, I was hoping that verification would just go away altogether, because it's always been a thing where, you know, and I've been around long enough that, you know, we had no connection with the IRS. And at one point, we used to collect paper tax returns if you were selected for verification, because they will randomly select. They would randomly select, and usually it was someone receiving a Pell Grant, because that's the only federal, you know, grant dollars, select students, and we would have to collect signed copies of tax returns. Then at one point it went to transcripts, then it went back to tax return. Then when we started getting these connection with the IRS, previously, as long as they used that, we didn't have to verify tax data. Now everyone's required to do you know, provide a grant access to that IRS data. And the other item that we used to have to verify was household size and number in college, because that used to affect the bottom line. And with all of that no longer really being in play, I thought, oh, great, we won't have to do this. But when they were bringing out this new FAFSA, they said, well, it's probably just going to look different, right? And then we went through kind of a nightmare with the form. And so they said, oh, we're going to be nice to you and we're not going to select anyone. But now we're getting into a point where they're probably going to select people. We have also had instances where the IRS came back, like there was a match fail, PII match fail, so the private information, and so no data came in, and so now we have to collect a tax return, so that could be something. What other instances? Oh, or no return on file, but then they kind of self-reported information, so there may be things that the institution has to follow up on and collect documentation on, so just be back in touch with them as soon as you're able to. These are just some kind of notes. You know, we're going to review the applications, determine what we're able to offer. It might or might not be sent with that admission decision. And again, you know, each institution is different in their timing. And so, you know, don't be surprised if you receive something from one institution and you're waiting, you know, to get something from another institution. You can always call and ask about that timing, and know that students have, you know, time to be able to make a decision as well. So verification, I'm not going to really kind of go into this because I really just already spoke about it. It's just really providing that tax information typically is what is going to be asked. This slide, you know, I think is kind of funny, particularly the bottom one, like how can you contact us? Phone, email, chat, like you contact any other entity, and don't be afraid to call and ask questions. You know, my kind of push is always with my staff is, you know, we're best when our students are first, right? And trying to help students through the process, help families through the process to understand, because we know it's a lot of information, and this is an investment, right, in themselves, and you are making an investment, and we want to be able to help in the best possible way. Questions you might ask, you know, what does this look like in year 2? Right? And hopefully an institution would say, you know, as far as any sort of need-based aid, as long as income and assets and family size stay about the same, you'll see a similar package. I know that there are some institutions out there that create a financial aid package in year 1, and then there are no changes, right? It just kind of continues on. And, you know, but there might be the ability to appeal. How will private scholarships affect financial aid? Again, we'll look at that when we look at the sample financial aid award that's coming up. Special considerations like changes in family circumstances. How can I appeal if I do have those changes? What is your process and the timing on that? Whoops. Okay, so how financial aid decisions are made. So the basic formula to determine eligibility is taking the cost of attendance, right? And the cost of attendance is kind of this full figure that you see often on a website for an institution. And it includes not just the billed costs that you see in green, tuition fees, housing and food that as long as the student's living on campus, that you're receiving a bill for, but it also includes estimates for books and supplies, transportation, and personal expenses. And that actually is regulated by the government. The government says these are the things that you include in the cost of attendance. It doesn't quite regulate the figures for those estimates, although for food and housing, we're required to, it has to be 3 meals a day that we're kind of including within that cost of attendance. So that is the beginning of the formula. From that cost of attendance, we subtract out this figure that's called a student aid index, and that is the output from the FAFSA. The formula, to just kind of give a general overview, the kind of formula to get to this SAI is taking, both on the student side and the parent side, taking income, right, total income, and then there are allowances against income, like allowance for taxes paid, your actual taxes paid, federal, state. There is an allowance for maintenance of a household based on household size, and then there's various conversions that happen with assets and all of that, and then it comes out with this student aid index figure. Some bullet points here you see kind of they've defined it as representing a family's financial strength. It's the same federal formula used for every family. As I noted before, it's an income-driven formula, so income weighs more heavily. Some colleges will use an institutional formula, but it's very similar, right? It asks for more data. There are some more allowances in there in awarding their own funds, so that would be through that CSS profile form. That the family, the premise is that family has the primary responsibility for paying. The SAI is not necessarily what the family will pay. There certainly are SAI calculators out there. There's one on MIFA.org if that was something that you were interested in looking at. So cost of attendance minus this student aid index determines financial aid eligibility. So this is the point where I would rather talk about loans, because to try to let you understand and get you to understand, like, how is a student eligible for that subsidized loan? If the cost of attendance, and let's say it's $60,000, I'm just going to use some round numbers so I don't have to do hard math, right? Let's say the cost of attendance was $60,000. Let's say this student aid index was $10,000. Their financial aid eligibility is $50,000, right? Let's say they are receiving scholarship and grant aid that was $30,000, right? So that's still $20,000 of eligibility. As long as there's a positive number there that's greater than $3,500 or equal to, they're going to be eligible for that subsidized loan. So that is how that subsidized portion is determined. The same is true for work study. They have to have positive financial aid eligibility in order to be eligible for work study. If this cost of attendance was $60,000 and the student aid index was $70,000, that is a situation where the student doesn't have any financial aid eligibility, but they're still able to borrow that $5,500 loan, and it would be fully unsubsidized. So that option still exists. So the colleges, we're going to, within this financial aid eligibility, we're going to produce a financial aid letter that lets the family know all of the items that the student is kind of eligible for through federal, state, if possible, and institutional sources. Excuse me. So this is the first kind of sample financial aid letter. sample financial aid package. Here we're using this kind of $45,000 cost of attendance. And so first, what comes up first, like this family has a $5,000 SAI. So their eligibility is $40,000, right? So the $45,000 cost of attendance minus $5,000 SAI. So what so we kind of say like the first thing in the bucket, right, is that SAI. And so the student was given a grant of $17,500, scholarship $10,000. So really at the end of the day, free money, that's $27,500. They've been offered the student loan, that's $5,500. In this example, because there is still eligibility there, I just like to point out that that would actually be 2 line items, subsidized $3,500, unsubsidized $2,000, not just one straight number, but the total loan amount, $5,500. And then they're offered the ability to work on campus up to earning up to $2,000. And what I do like to point out is loans, grant, and scholarship, that goes directly to the bill, right? And work study is the students actually receiving that paycheck. So sometimes it's like, well, how does that all kind of connect? But we remember in that cost of attendance, there are estimates for books, personal expenses, and travel. So oftentimes the student is using that for personal expenses, but as I always say, that's also a discussion amongst family, right? Maybe the student is working and saving in the fall semester to put a little bit toward that spring bill. That is determined by the family. And so if you had done the math, you realize, well, that didn't add up to that $40,000. And that's because not all institutions meet full need. And we'd like to, point that out. There's a small group of institutions that do meet full need. And so it might be that there's kind of this unmet need. And so a couple of things that I do want to stress, and one of them is that those estimates for, books, personal expenses, travel, those are simply estimates. It doesn't mean that you're actually paying that amount. And I can give an example with my oldest. I remember her first semester, she called me and said, and she's kind of whispering, Aiden found all of my books online. I don't have to pay anything. I was like, great. So I remember when I went to school, you had to pay for books, and you tried to, jeepers, you tried to sell them back for like nothing, and they were super expensive, and you had one option, which was the bookstore. Now there are a lot of options that exist. There's rental programs, purchase programs, possibly finding them online. And so just kind of putting that out there. Additionally, this is where I circle back to the idea of is it worth the work for outside scholarships, right? And so, yes, it is work, but there are ways to make it a little more simple. There are prompts that you can grab, and the student can maybe write some preset, oh my gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Essays. And have those set, and maybe they can send off, a bunch of them, because they'll say, for any of those ones that you're doing through, a larger organization, you probably need to apply to 10 to net 1, and don't discount the $1,000 awards. Sometimes people are looking for those like really, large ones, which yes, that would be great, but you get a lot more competition there, and guess what? Those little ones add up as well. And so it could be that, in comparing the information at different schools, and we're going to look at some comparisons, and the student may have their heart set on one particular school, and the conversation, is around, okay, well, this isn't really the best financial option. What can we do? And so maybe it does become worth the work for that student to really search out and secure some of that outside funding. Sometimes I see that so much is wrapped into making that first year work, right? And remember that it's more than just, that first year. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. I spoke about, that there are some tools to be able to know, right, without having completed a FAFSA, without having any information from the school specific to your child and your family. There is something called a net price calculator that every institution is required to have on their website. I will say that some are better than others, right? And sometimes it feels like, oh my gosh, I'm putting so much information here. But net price is defined by the Department of Education as the cost of attendance, so again, that larger figure, minus just grants and scholarships of a student that kind of, of a student that is a current, like, first-year student. That's what we're required to provide in that net price calculator. There's something called the College Scorecard, which is a website the Department of Education maintains. We're required to report data annually, and they use that data to populate that scorecard. I give places props when they do things well. It's simple to look at. It has a lot more than just financial aid data. It has academic information. It has information about school size. So it's kind of a nice spot to go if you're starting the process of looking at institutions, right? And you can even kind of narrow it down by type or size or region. When you detail in, it does give you average net price to start. You can detail in further, and then by income band, it has information. But when you get to things like an institution's net price calculator, then you're typically inputting information, right, about your child and yourself, that financial information. If an institution does merit scholarship, they may also wrap that in and ask about GPA and may provide an estimate of that. But it gives you a sense of, okay, a student who looks like my child, myself, financially, this is what they received and what their net price is. So that at least gives you a sense as you're going through the process of what might we end up receiving. My one caution is, the input out is only as good as the input that goes into it. So just make sure you're looking at the questions carefully and answering those accurately. All right, so these are two slides that just show some more kind of samples. Really what we're getting into here is you might see variety, right? So we have College A here that is meeting full need. And then we have College B and C where, and the difference is all in the kind of grant scholarship range. And so it's just, this is a reality that you may see differences in funding. The other thing, and you can see at the top here, this College Cost Transparency Initiative, not all letters look the same. And sometimes it might be confusing trying to figure out what exactly are they saying, what are they telling us, and there's been a lot of push. Like for instance, the Department of Education really pushes provide net cost based on that letter in there. It's interesting because I've been providing that in our letters for the last, I don't know how many years now, maybe 5, and it actually ends up being really confusing because what a family really wants to know is, because they'll come in on accepted student say, but what is the bill going to look like? Because that figure is not the same. That bill, what that bill is going to look like is going to be a lower number. This I apologize. This particular slide is something that drives me crazy, is that, and I don't know how many institutions still exist that do this, and my caution here is don't look just at the total. Because, College A here, which has a $27,500 in grant and scholarship, and College C, that is giving 0, but the total looks the same. They've put in, and both of these two have put in a parent loan and inserted that within. Most people I know in the industry, find that just to not be something that we would ever do, but there are some institutions that do that. A parent would still need to apply for a loan, be approved for a loan, and to me, that feels a bit like trickery. So just be careful, and you know what, and ask questions. If you have any question about what is included or what things look like in different years, ask those questions. I would say every single, because I've been to a number of them, like any accepted students' days that are available, they'll often have that you can go meet with the financial aid office, whether those are one-on-one appointments or it's a general session and then you could talk to someone after. But I think that's always really important to do as well. So this is the point where you're saturated with information. And believe me, I remember being a parent, I hated June because I felt like by June I was like so done. So I appreciate you guys being so patient. I know that I often tell stories, but I really feel like I'm trying to give good nuggets of information. But we're almost to the end. And so just very quickly, I'm just going to kind of gloss over this a little bit, but it's just that to know that, like, when paying that balance due, it doesn't have to just come out of one area. It could be just like any kind of large purchase, whether it's a car, whether it's a home, or what have you, maybe it's coming out of different buckets. So, we have past income. I kind of joked when my daughter, who's a first year, she's the 100% going on 19, who just loves to spend her money at Starbucks and DoorDash and all of that. And so I remember joking, because I did the presentation at her high school, like, oh, maybe your child's like mine, and they've been saving money, and they're going to put some of that toward the bill. But maybe there's some kind of past income, right? So savings, whether it's a saving plan, a particular college saving plan, or just some savings that you have, thinking about, like, what is going to go, from there that might help. Present income, current wages. Again, every institution pretty much has these payment plans available. So again, just thinking about, far back where it was like you made a payment in the fall and a payment in the spring, there are opportunities to, and oftentimes you can customize it, so it doesn't have to be. When I worked at Harvard, the payment plan was like, if you chose that, your entire bill just went into this payment plan. You paid monthly, right? But where I am now and a lot of other places, we kind of contract with payment plan companies that, it's like a $40 or $50 fee, and you break those payments up, but you can kind of decide. So if I'm going to take this out of, some, an asset, but I want to put this into a payment plan and just make it a little bit easier and over several months rather than one straight payment. And then perhaps there's some coming from borrowing, so that this is outside of those student loans, right, that we talked about, but kind of additional borrowing. And that's where I do, provide caution, right, of thinking carefully about how much a student is borrowing, because it's that when a student gets, their mind really set on one particular school, and maybe there's no funding available, or it's kind of out of reach, and they're like, no, I'm going to take this loan, I'm going to do whatever it, takes, and maybe a parent is wanting to help with that and co-sign on that loan, but it's that sort of borrowing that is, overreaching, or sometimes it's on the graduate side where there's less in scholarship and grant funding available, and sometimes I see it on our grad side where they're borrowing to cover costs and housing, because it's in that cost of attendance, and we try to help limit that and help with smart borrowing, but I feel like there's like a train outside here. So anyway, so just, as long as it's being done wisely and carefully, borrowing can be a helpful tool, but for every family, it's different. And I would also say, I think we go into these kind of kitchen table conversations. I personally will always encourage families to, as early as possible, have a conversation with your child around what I call financial fit. right? So we often talk about academic fit and the personal fit and how they feel on campus, but financial fit is another component, and at this point where it's still early, I think it's a really great time to have that conversation. Obviously, it's different for every family, and I can't force people to have that conversation, but I've seen it where I had a dad one time who, after deposit, after getting to the bill, and the bill was like almost due, and then he said, I didn't want to disappoint her. And then he wasn't able to make that payment, right? Well, that's a lot worse. Or that point where they're trying to make the decision on May 1st, and then, that actually we can't do this. So that encouragement of having those conversations as early as possible, I think can be helpful. Looking at, a balanced college list, and I know that you guys will go through conversations around, admission as well, but, just as you have a list that might have kind of academic balance, but maybe financial balance as well. Here in the state of Massachusetts, when I first started out in financial aid, the funding at the state level was abysmal. But in the last couple of years, they have poured a lot of money in. Maybe 3 years ago, they started with free community college for 25 and up, and then last year, it was free community college for all students in the state of Massachusetts. And so perhaps that's an option that the student wants to start, get 2 years under their belt, and then transfer. And there are options as well for transferring from community college to any of the public institutions, and there are also some, you could look at some of the private institutions who have started to make some collaborations with the community colleges as well. I think the students, some feedback, I've heard is like students, they should be like meeting with advising and making sure, right, that they're actually following a good track that's going to get them into that 4 year, but those credits will transfer, and if they meet a certain GPA, there's money that goes along with that at the public 4 year institutions as well. Thinking about the number of children going, thinking about debt, and what 4 years might look like, especially if someone's kind of zoned in on that 1 year and making it happen. Like, well, what is this going to look like? What are you thinking you want to do as a career? How much schooling is that going to take, and what does your starting salary look like, and is it reasonable, to take on that level of debt? Some of the other things is like knowing your children and what sort of needs they may have, right? And asking those questions. Again, any of those accepted students days or days that you're just going on campus and maybe meeting with admission, ask about, what's available on this campus as far as services. Again, and your children. And I can think of, my own child where she was like, oh, I'm going somewhere down south. And I know there's a lot of people going down south. And I said, I know you and I know me, and I'm not getting on a plane 3 weeks in when your anxiety is through the roof. And, and of course, then you have those moments of, oh, did I push her to stay a little bit closer? Was it right? And I can tell you that at the beginning of October, when she got very, very sick with a cold and a fever and all of this, and on a Sunday night, we were able to just drive 20 minutes and pick her up and take her home. And then she crawled into my bed and said, I'm so glad I'm close. I was like, okay, I did know my child. And then, or does a gap year, is that a benefit for the student, or some other option? So I think all of these things are on the table to have as discussion points. I already kind of hit a little bit on this with the, and I don't know why. I think it's a political thing. One person created the Mass Reconnect. That was the first community college, and now the new administration was like, no, we're making it for everyone, but it's two separate programs. It's the same thing. But if you're under 25, it's Mass Educate. The Mass Grant, so the Mass Grant expansion, Mass Grant is that state funding that I said is similar to a Pell Grant, but at the state level, although it's a much smaller amount. I talked about the max Pell Grant was $7,395, max Mass State grant is $3,000. But the Mass Grant Plus is free for, I think, income 80,000 or less, or reduced, so up to 100,000. It's half tuition and fees for at the public four-year institutions. What I will say with all of these programs, just being in the institution this year and having them all kind of kick off, the state is overspent. So I always wonder, like, what is going to stay, what is not going to stay, but currently that all exists. And then they also put forward the tuition equity law, so that is students who are not U.S. citizens or permanent residents and have attended a Massachusetts high school for at least 3 years are eligible for state funding, excuse me, as well as in-state tuition at the public institutions. Mass transfer is what I talked to about the community college and the transfer over to the four-year, and that there can be funding with that. And then, you know, there can be reduction for, you know, you might see some colleges like up in Maine, often they'll do like a New England rate, or if our public institutions don't have a particular program, you can often go at another state and get that in-state rate. Okay, so very quickly, FAFSA Day, you already heard me talk about that, but we have events that help, free events to help people if they have questions or need help in filling out the FAFSA form. Mass EdCo is something in the state of Massachusetts that is free financial aid and career readiness help. So you have their website there, and then MIFA has their website, MIFA Pathway, that also, and their resources extend down from like 6th grade all the way up to 12th grade. You don't even want to look at this because that's really small and overwhelming, but you can check off one thing, which is attend MIFA's Financial Aid 101 webinar. And I don't know if this is going to be shared or you can, you know, rewatch that, but, you know, that's something that you can also find on MIFA's website. I would also suggest that, you know, to sign, and this MIFA's financial aid offer and college bill webinar, that's what I was referencing at the beginning of the presentation. That's a really great thing in that springtime when you're kind of looking at all of these different, you know, admission and financial aid information. Sign up for MIFA emails. I have in the past signed up for them because I wanted to make sure that if I'm telling other people to sign up for them, that I found benefit from them. They're timely. You're not getting overwhelmed with them. They kind of stretch them out, but it's reminders of things, right? And you'll get notification of those different webinars. So it is helpful. And you can even stay on in the following year. Like they'll say, oh, did you want to stay on with these? And again, it's just great reminders as you go through the process, because it's a little bit of a different timeline when students are returning to school as opposed to being a first-year student. Okay, thank you. Are there any lingering questions? Okay, well, I will stay up here if there are any questions. I will say that I worked from home.